November 1895. Consuelo Vanderbilt stands in the long library at Blenheim Palace 3 weeks after her wedding. The room stretches nearly 200 feet, lined with books no one reads. Outside, the Oxfordshire countryside lies flat and gray under winter cloud. Inside, silence fills the spaces between furniture older than her country. She is 18 years old, a duchess, and worth millions. Her husband has just informed her, with precision she will come to recognize, that he finds her American manners tiresome and her conversation dull. He leaves the room without waiting for a response. The wedding had been called the social event of the decade. 75,000 people gathered outside St. Thomas Church in New York to watch her arrive. The ceremony cost her family the equivalent of $6 million in today's currency, though the actual price, $2.5 million paid directly to the Duke to save Blenheim from ruin, remained unspoken in public accounts. Consuelo had cried throughout the service. The newspapers noted her emotion as bridal joy. Now she occupies rooms that feel like museums, married to a man who regards her as a necessary acquisition, living among people who consider her wealth vulgar and her presence an intrusion. The life she was trained for since childhood has delivered her here, to beauty without warmth, status without belonging, and a future already determined by decisions made before she could speak. This is where her story begins, though its architecture was built much earlier. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in 1877 into a family that had acquired more money in 2 generations than most European dynasties accumulated in centuries. Her grandfather, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, built a shipping and railroad empire through methods that made competitors disappear and workers expendable. By the time of his death in 1877, he controlled more wealth than the United States Treasury. That fortune passed largely to his son William, who doubled it. William's children, including Consuelo's father, William Cassam Vanderbilt, inherited millions before they understood what money meant. Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo's mother, came from Southern aristocracy that had lost everything in the Civil War. She married William Kissam in 1875, and the union gave her access to unlimited resources and a permanent sense of inadequacy. New York society, controlled by old Dutch and English families, treated the Vanderbilts as industrial upstarts. Alva experienced this rejection as a physical wound. She built a French chateau on Fifth Avenue at a cost of $3 million, forcing Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her existence by hosting a ball so extravagant the city had never seen its equal. 1,000 guests attended. Alva had breached the wall, but the victory felt incomplete. She remained new money in a world that valued bloodlines over bank accounts. Consuelo absorbed her mother's ambitions before she could walk. Alva did not raise a daughter. She engineered a social instrument. The child's day began at 6 in the morning with exercises designed to perfect her posture. A steel rod was placed against her spine during lessons. She wore a leather harness at night to prevent slouching in sleep. Alva inspected her daughter's back each morning, checking for any deviation from the required straightness. The checks occurred in silence. Approval came as absence of correction. Consuelo saw other children only under supervision. Alva selected companions from appropriate families, then monitored their interactions to ensure nothing common or unrefined infected her daughter's developing character. Spontaneous play did not exist. Scheduled activities replaced it. French lessons, music instruction, dancing practice, watercolor painting. Each skill served a purpose, preparation for a life among people who would judge every gesture. Consuelo learned to move through rooms as if being watched, because she was always being watched. The family divided time between the Fifth Avenue Chateau, a summer estate in Newport called Marble House, and occasional trips to Europe. Marble House cost $11 million and required 500 workers 3 years to complete. Alva designed it as a temple to her own vision, with herself as the deity it honored. The ballroom featured solid bronze beams weighing 10 tons each. The dining room chairs were gilded and upholstered in velvet, too heavy for women to move without assistance. Consuelo's bedroom looked over the Atlantic, but she was not permitted to leave the house unaccompanied. The ocean remained something she observed through glass. At 13, Consuelo began to understand that her life was not her own in any sense she had once imagined. Alva spoke frequently and openly about her daughter's future marriage. The conversations did not include consultation. Alva described the type of man Consuelo would marry, titled European, preferably English. She explained that American men, even wealthy ones, lacked the refinement and social position worthy of a Vanderbilt daughter. The greatest families in America were nothing compared to European aristocracy. A duke, an earl at minimum, someone whose ancestors had decided the fates of nations. Consuelo ventured no objections. Her mother's certainty occupied all available space in any room they shared. Alva's voice did not rise when she described these plans. She stated them as facts already accomplished, futures merely awaiting their scheduled arrival. To question them would be to question gravity or the succession of seasons. Consuelo learned to nod, to listen, to feel her own preferences dissolve before they could form fully enough to speak aloud. The marriage of Alva and William Kissam deteriorated throughout Consuelo's adolescence. William kept mistresses without particular discretion. Alva retaliated by making their home increasingly uncomfortable, redecorating compulsively, hosting parties designed to exclude him, and focusing her considerable will on their daughter's future. The worse the marriage became, the more essential Consuelo's perfect match appeared to Alva. Her daughter would succeed where she had failed. The girl would marry into a family that made the Astors look provincial. In 1892, Alva shocked New York society by divorcing William. Divorce among the wealthy was rare enough to be scandalous. A woman initiating divorce was nearly unthinkable. Alva absorbed the judgment and moved forward without visible hesitation. She retained Marble House and a substantial financial settlement. She also retained custody of Consuelo, who was 15. The girl had no say in this arrangement. Her father, occupied with his own concerns, raised no meaningful objection to losing his daughter. After the divorce, Alva's focus on Consuelo intensified. The girl was now 17, approaching the age when marriages were arranged. Alva began taking her to Europe each season, introducing her to titled men at carefully orchestrated gatherings. Consuelo learned to curtsy, to make conversation in French, to dance waltzes with men twice her age who evaluated her as one might evaluate a horse before purchase. She understood, without needing to be told, that these men were interested in her father's money, not her watercolors or her posture or her silent compliance. During one of these trips at a gathering in Paris, Consuelo watched her mother negotiate with a French count whose estate was failing. The conversation occurred in a corner of a ballroom, Alva's voice low but audible if one stood close enough. She discussed financial arrangements, annual allowances, and the responsibilities Consuelo would assume. The count listened with the expression of a man conducting business. When the conversation ended, he bowed to Alva, then turned to Consuelo and smiled. She smiled back, because that was what she had been trained to do. The arrangement ultimately fell through for reasons Alva never explained. Consuelo felt relief, then guilt for feeling relief, then nothing at all. By 1894, Consuelo had learned to exist at a careful distance from her own life. She performed the required actions, spoke the required words, and felt as little as possible. Alva praised her daughter's grace and composure. She did not notice, or chose not to notice, that the girl had disappeared somewhere behind her own eyes. In the summer of 1893, Consuelo met Winthrop Rutherford at a Newport gathering. He was 28, she was 16. He came from an old New York family with respectable wealth, but no title, no European lineage, nothing that registered as significant in Alva's calibration of social worth. He was tall, athletic, known for his skill with horses and his easy manner among both men and women. When he spoke to Consuelo at that first meeting, he asked her what she thought about a book she had mentioned, then waited for her actual answer. The experience of being addressed as though her thoughts mattered felt unfamiliar enough to disorient her. They encountered each other again 2 weeks later at a tennis party. Rutherford played well, but without the aggressive competitiveness she had observed in other men of his position. Between matches, he sat beside her and spoke about a trip he had taken to Montana, describing landscapes she had only read about. He did not perform for her. He seemed to assume she was someone worth talking to rather than someone who needed to be impressed or evaluated. When he asked if she played tennis, and she explained that her mother considered it unladylike, he nodded without judgment and changed the subject. Consuelo began to notice when Rutherford was present at social events. She did not seek him out. That would have been impossible under Alva's supervision, but she became aware of his location in any room they shared. Sometimes she found him already watching her, and he would smile slightly, a private acknowledgement that something unspoken existed between them. These moments lasted seconds. They were enough to make the hours of performance bearable. By the following summer, their connection had developed into something neither of them named aloud, but both understood. Rutherford began attending events he would have otherwise avoided, arriving at gatherings where Consuelo would be present. They were never alone. The social machinery of Newport made privacy impossible for unmarried young people of their class. But they learned to communicate in fragments, brief conversations when groups shifted, exchanges of glances across crowded rooms, the positioning of themselves near each other without appearing to do so deliberately. In August 1894, at a garden party at the Astor Estate, Rutherford managed to speak with Consuelo for nearly 10 minutes while others were distracted by a croquet match. He told her he had been thinking about her constantly. He said this quietly, without drama, as a statement of fact that troubled him. She felt something unlock inside her chest. She told him she thought of him as well. They stood in silence after that, surrounded by people who noticed nothing. And Consuelo felt for the first time that her life might contain possibilities her mother had not predetermined. Rutherford began writing to her. The letters arrived through a friend, a girl Consuelo had known since childhood, who understood the necessity of discretion. The notes were brief, careful, nothing that would be damaging if discovered, but their existence meant everything. He wrote about places he wanted to show her, conversations he wanted to have, a future he was beginning to imagine. Consuelo wrote back, her responses equally cautious. She signed them with only her first initial. The correspondence continued through the fall. In November, Alva noticed something had changed in her daughter. Consuelo had become less perfectly obedient, less immediate in her responses, less present during the inspections and instructions that structured their days. She seemed to be thinking about something beyond the room she occupied. Alva, who missed nothing that threatened her designs, began to ask questions. Who had Consuelo been speaking with at various events? Who were her current correspondents? The questions came casually, embedded in other conversation, but Consuelo recognized them as interrogation. She denied everything because there was nothing specific to deny. She had exchanged no improper words, made no promises, committed no action that violated the explicit rules governing her behavior. But Alva's suspicion, once activated, did not require evidence to justify itself. She began monitoring Consuelo more closely, reading her mail before it reached her, questioning servants about visitors, restricting her daughter's movements even more than usual. In December, Alva found one of Rutherford's letters. The friend who had been passing them had left it in a book she returned to Consuelo. A maid tidying the room found it and brought it to Alva. The letter contained nothing scandalous, only Rutherford's hope that he might see Consuelo at an upcoming Christmas gathering and his observation that her company made social obligations less tedious. The tone was warm but respectful, the content innocent by any reasonable measure. Alva responded as though she had uncovered evidence of criminal conspiracy. She summoned Consuelo to her private sitting room and placed the letter on the table between them. She did not raise her voice. She explained, with the patience of someone instructing a slow child, that Winthrop Rutherford was an impossible choice. His family was adequate but unremarkable. He had no title, no international standing, no value to the Vanderbilt position in society. He was exactly the kind of person Consuelo had been raised to transcend. Any further contact with him would be considered disobedience of the most serious kind. Consuelo tried to argue. She said she cared for Rutherford. She said he was kind and intelligent and treated her with respect. She said with more force than she had ever used with her mother that she should have some voice in choosing whom she would marry. Alva listened to these objections without interruption. When Consuelo finished, Alva informed her that she was mistaken about what she felt. At 17, she lacked the experience to understand her own emotions. What she called affection was confusion. What she imagined was love was simply the novelty of male attention. Alva had not spent 17 years preparing her daughter for greatness, only to watch her throw it away on an American with good manners and mediocre prospects. The conversation ended with Alva's instruction that Consuelo would not attend any event where Rutherford might be present. All correspondence would be monitored. The friendship that had facilitated the letters was terminated. Consuelo was informed that in the spring they would return to Europe, where appropriate introductions would be arranged. She left her mother's sitting room, understanding that her life had just narrowed to a path with no exits. Rutherford learned of the prohibition through mutual acquaintances. He attempted twice to reach Consuelo, once through a letter delivered by a cousin, once by appearing at a church service he knew she would attend. Both attempts failed. Alva had established a perimeter around her daughter that could not be breached without creating a scandal neither family could afford. In March 1895, Alva and Consuelo sailed for Europe aboard a steamship fitted with private suites that cost more than most families earned in a decade. Alva had arranged a season in London with introductions to several titled families facing financial difficulties severe enough to make an American heiress attractive despite her origins. She carried with her a mental catalog of available aristocrats, their debts itemized, their estates assessed, their willingness to negotiate already tested through preliminary correspondence with intermediaries. The Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, appeared on Alva's list as the most promising option. He was 23, had inherited his title at 19 when his father died, and now controlled Blenheim Palace, one of England's most historically significant estates and one of its most expensive to maintain. The palace required a staff of 40 just to keep the staterooms presentable. The roof leaked in a dozen places. The farmland that should have generated income had been mismanaged for decades. The Duke's annual expenses exceeded his income by approximately £40,000, a deficit that had been growing since his grandfather's time. Marlborough needed money immediately. His family's attempts to restore solvency through traditional aristocratic methods, strategic marriages within their class, appeals to wealthy relatives, economies in household management, had all failed. The Duke faced a choice between marrying an American heiress or watching Blenheim deteriorate past the point of rescue. He had made inquiries about several potential brides. Alva's response to these inquiries made clear that she could provide more money than anyone else currently negotiating in the international marriage market. The introduction occurred at a London dinner party in April. Alva had prepared Consuelo with particular care that evening, selecting a white gown that made her look older than her 17 years, arranging her dark hair in a style that emphasized the length of her neck. The Duke arrived late, a power move Alva recognized and catalogued. He was handsome in the specific way of English aristocrats, pale, fine-featured, with an expression of permanent boredom that suggested nothing could surprise or impress him. He spoke to Consuelo for 20 minutes, seated beside her at dinner. His conversation consisted primarily of observations about people they both knew, delivered in a tone that made each observation sound like criticism. He asked few questions. When Consuelo mentioned that she enjoyed reading, he responded that most women claim to enjoy things they did not understand. When she fell silent after that, he seemed satisfied, as though her silence confirmed his assessment. After dinner, he spoke with Alva privately for nearly an hour. The courtship, if it could be called that, proceeded without romance or even basic courtesy. Marlborough called on Consuelo at their London residence 3 times over the next 2 weeks. During these visits, he discussed Blenheim's history, his family's role in English politics, and the responsibilities that came with his title. He spoke about himself without pause or self-consciousness, describing his position in society as though explaining weather patterns, observable facts that existed independent of human preference. Consuelo listened and said little. Her silence did not trouble him. By May, Alva and the Duke's lawyers had begun formal negotiations. The discussions occurred without pretense that this was anything other than a business arrangement. Marlborough required an immediate payment of $2.5 million to clear Blenheim's debts and fund essential repairs. He also wanted an annual income of $100,000 for life, guaranteed regardless of what happened to the marriage. In exchange, Consuelo would become the Duchess of Marlborough. Her children would inherit one of England's most significant titles, and the Vanderbilt name would be permanently attached to English aristocracy. Alva found the terms acceptable. The money meant nothing to her. William Kissam's divorce settlement had left her with resources she could not exhaust in 3 lifetimes. What she purchased with those millions was vindication. The same New York families who had scorned her as new money would be forced to acknowledge her daughter as nobility. Every slight Alva had endured, every door that had opened slowly, every look of assessment from women who considered themselves superior, All of it would be answered by a title that predated American independence. Consuelo learned the terms of her own marriage from her mother in June. They were staying at a rented estate outside London when Alva informed her that the negotiations were complete. The Duke had agreed to marry her. The wedding would take place in New York in November, giving them time to arrange a ceremony appropriate to the alliance being formed. Alva presented this information as good news, her voice warm with satisfaction. Consuelo said she did not want to marry the Duke. She said it quietly, without conviction, because she already knew the words would change nothing. Alva's expression did not shift. She asked what Consuelo thought she wanted instead. When Consuelo mentioned Rutherford's name, Alva laughed, not with cruelty, but with genuine amusement at her daughter's persistence in holding on to something so obviously impossible. Alva explained, as though to a child, that Winthrop Rutherford was not a choice that existed in reality. He had no title, no international standing, no ability to secure the Vanderbilt family's position in the highest levels of society. Marrying him would mean remaining American, remaining limited, remaining among people who still regarded the Vanderbilts as industrialists who had bought their way into respectability. Did Consuelo understand what was being offered to her? Did she grasp that women with 10 times her beauty and intelligence would commit any act to have this opportunity? Consuelo said she understood, but she could not marry someone she did not love. Alva's amusement disappeared. She informed her daughter that love was a fantasy sold to poor people who had nothing else to comfort them. Women of their position married for family, for advancement, for the continuation of power. Affection might develop, or it might not. The question was irrelevant to the central purpose of marriage, which was the strategic alliance of resources and names. The conversation continued for 2 hours. Consuelo cried. Alva remained composed, answering each objection with logic that admitted no alternative interpretation. When Consuelo said she would refuse to go through with the wedding, Alva's voice finally hardened. She explained that refusal was not available as an option. The contracts were signed. The announcement would be made. If Consuelo attempted to humiliate her mother and the Duke by backing out of the arrangement, Alva would disown her completely. No money, no support, no family. Consuelo could attempt to make her way in the world with nothing, or she could accept the life that had been prepared for her. Consuelo stopped crying. She sat in silence while her mother waited for acknowledgement. Finally she nodded. Alva smiled and rose from her chair, kissing her daughter's forehead. She said Consuelo would be happy once she understood what had been accomplished on her behalf. The engagement announcement appeared in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic in July 1895. American papers described it as a fairy tale union between New World wealth and Old World aristocracy. British papers focused on the financial arrangements with varying degrees of discretion. Everyone understood what was occurring. The honesty of the transaction made it no less acceptable to those who benefited from maintaining the system that enabled such arrangements. Consuelo returned to New York in August to prepare for a November wedding. Alva had already begun planning before the engagement was finalized, hiring designers and caterers and florists with the understanding that details were settled even when they appeared open to discussion. The wedding would take place at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, with a reception following at the Vanderbilt Mansion on 72nd Street. 1,200 invitations were prepared. The guest list included every family of significance in New York society and representatives from European aristocracy who happened to be traveling in America that autumn. The Duke arrived in New York in October aboard a steamship that carried his valet, his personal secretary, and enough luggage to suggest permanent relocation. He stayed at the Vanderbilt Mansion as Alva's guest, occupying a suite on the 3rd floor while Consuelo remained on the 2nd. They saw each other at meals and during scheduled appearances at social events designed to display them as a couple to people whose opinions Alva valued. At these events, Marlborough spoke primarily to older men about politics and horses. Consuelo sat beside him, smiled when appropriate, and said almost nothing. In private, the Duke treated Consuelo with polite indifference. He did not inquire about her thoughts or preferences. He did not attempt conversation beyond what was required by immediate circumstance. When they were alone briefly, waiting for others to join them, he read newspapers or examined objects in whatever room they occupied. Consuelo understood that he regarded her as he might regard any acquisition, necessary for his purposes, requiring basic maintenance, ultimately interchangeable with other options if the terms had been different. 1 week before the wedding, Consuelo received a letter from Winthrop Rutherford. It had been delivered to a servant who remained loyal to her, passed through 3 intermediaries before reaching her hands. Rutherford wrote that he had learned of the engagement from newspapers. He said he understood the pressures she faced, the impossibility of her position, but he wanted her to know that he still cared for her. If she chose not to marry Marlborough, he would be waiting. He would help her in any way she asked. The letter ended with a request that she send word if she needed him. Consuelo read the letter alone in her bedroom. She folded it carefully and placed it in a jewelry box her grandmother had given her years before. She did not respond. To respond would be to acknowledge that an alternative existed, and acknowledging alternatives made the future she faced more difficult to accept. She had learned by this point that survival required narrowing one's vision to only what was inevitable. The night before the wedding, Consuelo could not sleep. She sat by her bedroom window watching Fifth Avenue below, mostly empty at 3 in the morning except for occasional carriages carrying people home from parties. She thought about the letter hidden in her jewelry box. She thought about Rutherford, about the possibility of sending word to him, of walking out of the house and disappearing into a city large enough to hide anyone who wanted to vanish. The thoughts were fantasy, and she knew it. She had no money of her own, no skills that would allow her to support herself, no place to go where her mother would not eventually find her. The world was not designed to accommodate women who refused the lives arranged for them. Morning came. Servants entered her room to begin the preparations that would transform her into a bride. The wedding dress had been made in Paris, imported at a cost of $6,000. It required 45 minutes to put on properly, with multiple attendants managing the layers of silk and lace and the train that extended 15 feet behind her. When they finished, Consuelo looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone she did not recognize. The woman reflected there was beautiful, expensively decorated, and completely hollow. Downstairs, Alva waited in her own elaborate gown, supervising last-minute arrangements with the efficiency of a general preparing for battle. When Consuelo appeared, Alva examined her daughter critically, adjusted a fold of fabric at her shoulder, and smiled with satisfaction. She told Consuelo she looked perfect. She did not ask how her daughter felt. The carriage ride to St. Thomas Church took 20 minutes through crowds that had gathered to witness the spectacle. Police held back 75,000 people who lined the streets, pressing against barriers to catch a glimpse of the bride. Consuelo sat beside her mother, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged in an expression she had practiced for weeks. She felt nothing. The numbness she had cultivated over recent months had finally achieved completeness. Inside the church, 1,200 guests stood as she entered. The aisle stretched impossibly long before her. At its end, the Duke waited beside the altar, his expression unchanged from any other day, as though he were attending someone else's wedding rather than his own. Consuelo began walking. Her father, William Kissam, walked beside her, but she barely registered his presence. The only detail she remembered later with clarity was that her face was wet. She was crying, had been crying since she stood up from the carriage, and could not stop. The newspapers would report her tears as evidence of overwhelming emotion, the natural result of joy too great to contain. Guests who witnessed the ceremony would repeat this interpretation at dinner parties for months afterward, describing the bride's obvious happiness. No one mentioned that her tears began before she entered the church and continued throughout the ceremony. No one suggested that a bride who could not stop crying might be experiencing something other than joy. The ceremony proceeded according to the schedule Alva had established. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed. The priest pronounced them married. Marlborough lifted Consuelo's veil and kissed her briefly, a gesture of conclusion rather than affection. Then it was finished. They walked back down the aisle as husband and wife exited the church to applause from the crowds outside, and returned to the mansion for a reception that lasted 7 hours. Marlborough spoke with business associates and aristocratic connections throughout the reception. Consuelo stood where she was positioned, accepted congratulations from people she barely knew, and performed gratitude she did not feel. Late in the evening, when most guests had departed, the Duke informed her they would sail for England in 3 days. He said this without consulting her preferences, because her preferences were no longer relevant to decisions about her own life. The crossing to England took 7 days through November storms that kept most passengers confined to their cabins. Consuelo and Marlborough occupied separate staterooms, an arrangement the Duke established without explanation on the first day. He spent his time playing cards with other first-class passengers or reading in the ship's library. Consuelo remained alone, watching gray water through a porthole, eating little, speaking to no one. On the third day, she realized her husband had not asked her a single question about herself since the wedding. On the fifth day, she understood he never would. They arrived at Southampton and traveled by train to Oxford, then by carriage through winter countryside to Blenheim. The palace appeared through bare trees on a December afternoon, enormous and somehow oppressive despite its architectural grandeur. It had been built in the early 18th century as a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough after his military victories. The scale was imperial. The main facade stretched 500 feet. The great court could accommodate hundreds of soldiers in formation. The staterooms were designed to intimidate visiting monarchs. Consuelo looked at it and felt something close to dread. The household staff assembled in the great court to receive their new duchess. 40 servants stood in formation: butlers, footmen, housekeepers, ladies' maids, kitchen staff, groundskeepers. They wore formal livery and maintained expressions of careful neutrality as Consuelo stepped from the carriage. The head butler, a man named Thornton, who had served the family for 30 years, bowed and welcomed her to Blenheim with words that sounded rehearsed. She thanked him and tried to remember the proper way to address English servants. Her voice sounded thin in the open air. Marlborough led her through rooms that felt more like museum galleries than living spaces. The long library where she would eventually spend much of her time. The saloon with its painted ceiling depicting the first Duke's victories. The state dining room with a table that could seat 50. The red drawing room, the green drawing room, the first stateroom, the second stateroom. Each space was filled with furniture too valuable to use, paintings of ancestors who stared with expressions of judgment, objects that existed to demonstrate wealth accumulated over centuries. Nothing was comfortable. Nothing suggested that human beings with ordinary needs actually inhabited these spaces. Her private apartments consisted of 6 rooms on the palace's east side. The bedroom featured a 4-poster bed that had belonged to the third Duchess. The sitting room contained chairs arranged for conversations that would never occur. The windows overlooked formal gardens designed in the previous century and maintained at considerable expense. Everything was cold. The fireplaces, despite burning continuously, could not compensate for stone walls 3 feet thick and windows that fit poorly in their frames. That first night, the Duke came to her bedroom at 11. He entered without knocking, still dressed in his dinner clothes. What followed was brief, silent, and purely mechanical. When he finished, he returned to his own apartments without speaking. Consuelo lay awake afterward, staring at the ceiling, understanding that this was how the production of heirs would occur. The process would be repeated until she became pregnant, then resumed after each birth until the required number of sons had been secured. Nothing about it involved her beyond her biological function. Within a week, the Duke's mother arrived. Albertha, the Dowager Duchess, was 60 years old and had controlled Blenheim's social operations since her own marriage 40 years earlier. She regarded Consuelo with open skepticism, conducting an inspection that resembled Alva's daily examinations, but with aristocratic coldness replacing American intensity. Albertha found fault with Consuelo's accent, her manners at tea, her unfamiliarity with proper modes of address for various ranks of nobility, her American habit of smiling at servants. Each criticism was delivered with precision designed to educate through humiliation. The lessons continued daily. Albertha established a schedule that governed every hour of Consuelo's existence. Morning calls, afternoon teas, formal dinners, charitable obligations, church attendance. Each activity came with rules. Consuelo had not been taught because they were considered too fundamental for explanation. She learned by making mistakes and having them corrected, usually in front of others. When she addressed a viscount incorrectly, Albertha repeated the proper form 3 times, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. When she sat in a chair before an older woman had been seated, the Dowager Duchess stood and walked out of the room, returning 10 minutes later without acknowledging what had occurred. English society proved less welcoming than Consuelo had feared, because it did not welcome her at all. Aristocratic families invited the Duke and Duchess to events out of obligation, then positioned Consuelo at the margins of conversation. The women spoke to each other with references to shared histories, schools, family connections going back generations. When they addressed Consuelo, they asked about America in tones that made it clear they considered the country a curiosity rather than a civilization. One woman asked, with apparent sincerity, whether Consuelo had seen actual Indians before coming to England. Another wondered aloud, however, how Americans learned manners when they had no hereditary aristocracy to model them. Marlborough watched these interactions without intervention. When Consuelo mentioned to him that she found English social gatherings difficult, he responded that adjustment would take time. When she asked if he might introduce her to people who shared her interests in reading or music, he said she misunderstood her position. Her function was to serve as Duchess of Marlborough, to host when required, to appear at appropriate events, and to produce children. Personal interests were subordinate to these duties. If she found the obligations tedious, that was unfortunate, but irrelevant. The isolation became comprehensive. Consuelo had no friends, no confidants, no one she could speak with honestly. Letters from America arrived irregularly and were opened before reaching her. She discovered this when her mother mentioned contents of a letter she had sent to a friend, contents that should have been private. The Duke controlled all household finances, including any personal expenses she might want to make. She had to request permission to purchase books, to hire a personal maid, to make any decision about her own daily existence. In January, 3 months after the wedding, Consuelo realized she was pregnant. She informed the Duke, who received the news with satisfaction and instructed her to engage a proper physician. He did not ask how she felt. The pregnancy became another obligation to manage, another duty to fulfill. The morning sickness lasted weeks. She spent hours alone in her apartments, too ill to attend social functions, grateful for the isolation, even as it deepened her sense of being trapped in a life that had nothing to do with who she was or might have been. The pregnancy advanced through winter and into spring. Consuelo spent most days confined to her apartments, following the physician's instructions for rest and limited activity. The doctor, an elderly man who had attended 3 generations of Marlborough births, treated her with the detached professionalism of someone managing livestock breeding. He examined her weekly, recorded measurements in a leather notebook, and offered no information beyond what was medically necessary. When she asked questions about what to expect during delivery, he told her that worry was unhealthy for the child, and she should occupy her mind with more pleasant thoughts. Albertha visited regularly to monitor the pregnancy's progress and to provide instruction on matters she considered essential. She explained that the first birth was crucial. A son would secure Consuelo's position and fulfill her primary obligation. A daughter would be disappointing but acceptable if followed quickly by sons. The Dowager Duchess spoke about the unborn child entirely in terms of inheritance and title succession, never as a person who would exist independent of those considerations. She described the nursery arrangements, the selection of nurses and governesses, the schedule that would govern the child's early years. Consuelo would not be expected to manage these details herself. That was what staff were for. Marlborough's interest in his wife increased slightly during the pregnancy, though it manifested as concern for the child rather than for Consuelo herself. He inquired about her health in the same tone he used to ask about repairs being made to the palace roof. When she was 7 months along, he informed her that he had engaged a London specialist to attend the birth, someone with experience delivering aristocratic heirs. The cost was substantial, but he considered it necessary insurance against complications that might threaten the succession. In September 1897, 2 years after the wedding, Consuelo went into labor. The delivery lasted 19 hours. The London specialist arrived too late to be useful, leaving the elderly physician to manage the birth with assistance from nurses who had been summoned from Oxford. Consuelo remembered pain that erased everything else, periods of unconsciousness, moments of clarity when she understood she might die, and felt something close to relief at the prospect. Then it was over. A son, alive and healthy. The physician announced the successful delivery with satisfaction, as though he had personally accomplished something significant. They named him John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, incorporating names from both family lines and enough royal references to signal appropriate respect for tradition. He would be called John. Marlborough visited the nursery once the child had been cleaned and examined, observed his son for several minutes without expression, then informed Consuelo that she had done well. He left before she could respond. The recovery took weeks. Consuelo remained weak, unable to walk without assistance, plagued by infections the physician treated with remedies that seemed to make things worse. She asked to see her son and was told that infants were too delicate to be handled by their mothers during the recovery period. The wet nurse, a woman from the village who had been selected by Albertha, fed the child in the nursery, while Consuelo remained in her bedroom, hearing occasional cries through closed doors. When she was finally permitted to hold John, 6 weeks after his birth, she felt a complicated mixture of connection and distance. He was small, fragile, entirely dependent on people who were not her. She had carried him for 9 months and nearly died bringing him into the world. But he belonged to Blenheim and the Marlborough succession more than he belonged to her. The nurses who cared for him followed schedules established by the Dowager Duchess. Consuelo's visits to the nursery were limited to specified hours that would not interfere with his feeding and sleeping routines. Marlborough resumed visiting her bedroom in November. The physician had cleared her for the resumption of marital duties, despite her continued weakness and the lingering pain from childbirth. The encounters remained exactly as they had been before: brief, silent, mechanical. The Duke showed no interest in whether she had recovered sufficiently, whether she experienced discomfort, whether she wanted to participate in the act that he treated as his right and her obligation. She learned to endure it by focusing on the ceiling's plasterwork, counting decorative elements until it was over. By January 1898, she was pregnant again. The Duke expressed satisfaction when informed. 2 sons would secure the succession beyond question and fulfill his obligation to the title. After that, he indicated, the matter would be concluded. Consuelo received this news with mixed feelings. Another pregnancy meant another year of illness and pain and danger. It also meant an eventual end to the bedroom visits she had come to dread. The second pregnancy proved more difficult than the first. She was sick constantly, unable to keep food down for weeks at a time. Her weight dropped to levels the physician considered concerning, but not dangerous enough to warrant intervention. She spent most days in bed, too weak to read, too nauseous to sleep properly. Marlborough did not alter his schedule or routines to accommodate her condition. He traveled to London for business and social obligations, attended race meetings and hunting parties, and returned to Blenheim only when his presence was required for estate matters. During one of his absences in the summer of 1898, Consuelo received a letter from her mother. Alva had remarried, a wealthy man named Oliver Belmont who shared her interest in social reform and women's suffrage. The letter described the wedding, the couple's plans to build a new estate, Alva's satisfaction with her new life. She mentioned Consuelo's situation only briefly, expressing confidence that motherhood would bring fulfillment and that any initial difficulties were temporary adjustments to a superior way of life. The letter ended with instructions that Consuelo should write more frequently and should remember how fortunate she was to hold such a distinguished position. Consuelo put the letter aside without responding. The distance between her mother's assumptions and her actual existence was too vast to address in correspondence. Alva believed she had secured her daughter's happiness through strategic planning and sufficient wealth. She could not comprehend, or chose not to comprehend, that money and titles provided no protection against loneliness, no remedy for being trapped in a life organized around functions rather than feelings. The second son, Ivor, was born in October 1898. The delivery was faster than the first, but more painful, leaving Consuelo with damage that the physician said might be permanent. She was 21 years old, had been married 3 years, and had fulfilled her primary obligation to the Marlborough succession. The Duke visited briefly after the birth, confirmed that the child was healthy and male, and informed her that he would be traveling to London for several weeks. He did not say what business required his absence. She did not ask. With 2 sons secured, Consuelo's biological function was complete. What remained was the social performance required of a duchess. The public display of position, the maintenance of appearances, the execution of duties that demonstrated Marlborough wealth and status to audiences who measured worth through visible expenditure and proper form. Albertha made clear that motherhood did not excuse Consuelo from these obligations. If anything, having produced heirs increased her value as a social asset. the calendar filled with scheduled obligations. Monday afternoons were designated for receiving calls from local gentry wives, women who visited out of duty rather than friendship, and who spent their allotted 15 minutes cataloging their own activities in tones that invited no response. Tuesday mornings involved inspecting charitable organizations in the surrounding villages, schools for poor children, hospitals for the indigent, workhouses where the desperate labored under conditions Consuelo was meant to observe but not question. Wednesday evenings required attendance at dinners hosted by other aristocratic families, events where 20-course meals were served to guests who competed to demonstrate indifference to the excess surrounding them. Thursdays were reserved for managing Blenheim's social calendar. Consuelo sat with the household staff to plan upcoming entertainments, weekend house parties that would host 30 guests, formal dinners for political allies of the Duke, hunting parties where men shot hundreds of birds in a single afternoon while their wives occupied themselves with cards and gossip. Each event required detailed planning, menus coordinated with the season, guest rooms assigned according to complex hierarchies of rank and favor, servants choreographed to execute service that appeared effortless. The cost of a single weekend party exceeded what most English families earned in a year. She learned to perform her role with mechanical precision. At dinners, she sat at the foot of the table opposite the Duke and made conversation with guests seated beside her, asking questions about their estates and families, listening to answers she would forget within hours. At charitable events, she toured facilities with expressions of concern that signaled appropriate sympathy without suggesting actual emotional investment. At social calls, she discussed weather and gardens and the challenges of maintaining historic properties, topics sufficiently neutral to offend no one and interest no one. The performance extended beyond scheduled obligations. Whenever she appeared in public, at church services, at village fairs, during drives through the countryside, she represented the Marlborough family and was expected to maintain appropriate dignity. This meant specific postures, particular facial expressions, careful modulation of voice and gesture. Albertha observed these public appearances and provided detailed corrections afterward. Consuelo had smiled too broadly at a shopkeeper. She had shown excessive interest in a child's drawing at a school exhibition. She had failed to maintain sufficient distance when speaking with servants at a hospital. Each correction reinforced the same lesson. Warmth was inappropriate. Genuine emotion was a failure of control. Connection with anyone outside her narrow class was a breach of the boundaries that sustained aristocratic authority. Marlborough began spending more time away from Blenheim. Business in London required his presence for weeks at a stretch. Political obligations demanded his attendance at parliamentary sessions. Social commitments, race meetings at Ascot, shooting parties in Scotland, yachting off the south coast, kept him traveling throughout the year. When he was present at Blenheim, he occupied his time with estate management and rarely spoke to Consuelo beyond what was necessary for household coordination. They ate dinner together when both were in residence, seated at opposite ends of a table designed to accommodate dozens, conducting conversations about nothing of consequence, while servants moved silently between them. During one of his absences in 1900, Consuelo learned through household gossip that her husband was maintaining a relationship with a London woman, someone from aristocratic background whose husband pursued his own separate arrangements. Such relationships were common among their class. Marriages were business contracts, emotional attachments were pursued elsewhere, and discretion was the only rule that mattered. Consuelo felt no jealousy. Instead, she felt a complicated relief. The Duke's attention had shifted away from her, which meant the bedroom visits occurred less frequently. His absence from Blenheim meant stretches of time when she did not have to perform for him. Her sons remained strangers she saw at scheduled intervals. John was 3, Ivor nearly 2. They lived in the nursery wing under the management of nurses and governesses selected by Albertha. Consuelo was permitted to visit them for 1 hour each afternoon, supervised by staff who ensured she did not disrupt the routines that governed their days. The children were being trained for their future roles, John as heir to the dukedom, Ivor as the spare who would support his brother's position. They learned proper posture before they learned to form complete sentences. They practiced formal greetings before they could tie their own shoes. When Consuelo tried to play with them during her visits, the head governess intervened, explaining that unstructured play was not part of the approved schedule. She began having trouble sleeping. Hours passed each night while she lay awake, her mind empty of thoughts but unable to rest. The palace physician prescribed tonics that made her drowsy but did not produce actual sleep, leaving her in a fog that persisted through the following day. She started experiencing unexplained pains in her chest, her stomach, her head. The physician examined her repeatedly and found nothing medically wrong. He suggested that she was suffering from nervous strain common among women of her position and prescribed more tonics, more rest, more time alone in her apartments. The isolation became a presence she could almost touch. At social events, surrounded by dozens of people, she felt more alone than when she was actually by herself. The conversations she participated in were scripted performances that required her attention, but never her actual participation. No one asked what she thought or felt. No one expressed interest in her beyond her function as the American Duchess who had saved Blenheim with Vanderbilt money. She existed as a role rather than a person, and the distinction between the two was disappearing. In the autumn of 1901, Consuelo sat in the long library during one of the Duke's London trips. The room was empty, except for a housemaid who dusted shelves at the far end, too distant to hear anything. Consuelo opened one of the books no one read, finding comfort in texts that had existed before her life and would exist after it. She came across a passage about a woman trapped in circumstances beyond her control, and for the first time in years, she cried. Not the public tears of her wedding day, but private grief for the life she might have lived if different choices had been available, if the architecture of wealth and position had permitted alternatives, if being born female and wealthy had not meant being purchased and positioned like furniture in a palace that felt more like a tomb with each passing year. By 1902, Consuelo had been married 7 years and was 25 years old. Her body had begun failing in ways that resisted medical explanation. The chest pains increased in frequency and intensity, arriving without warning and leaving her unable to breathe properly for minutes at a time. The headaches came in waves that lasted days, accompanied by sensitivity to light that forced her to remain in darkened rooms, while servants moved through her apartments in careful silence. Her appetite disappeared almost completely. Food tasted wrong, felt wrong in her stomach, often made her ill within hours of eating. The palace physician examined her monthly and found nothing. Her heart sounded normal. Her lungs were clear. Blood samples revealed no obvious disease. He concluded, as he had before, that she suffered from nervous disorders common to women of refined sensibility. He increased the dosages of the tonics he prescribed, laudanum-based mixtures that dulled sensation without providing relief. Consuelo took them because the alternative was enduring the pain without any intervention. But the medicines made her thoughts slow and her movements uncertain. She began to lose track of time, unable to distinguish one day from the next, in a routine that offered no variation significant enough to mark memory. Alberta attributed Consuelo's health problems to weakness of character. The Dowager Duchess mentioned, with some frequency, that English women endured far greater hardships without complaint. Childbirth, social obligations, and the management of large households were normal responsibilities that did not justify constant illness. When Consuelo was too unwell to attend a scheduled dinner party, Alberta suggested that American women lacked the constitution necessary for aristocratic life. The criticism was delivered as observation rather than insult, which made it more difficult to counter. Marlborough responded to his wife's declining health with irritation rather than concern. Her illnesses disrupted social obligations and created complications in the household's functioning. When she was unable to host a weekend party due to one of her episodes, he made clear that her absence reflected poorly on their family and demonstrated a failure to fulfill her duties. He did not ask what caused her pain. He asked when she would recover enough to resume normal activities. Letters from America arrived less frequently. Alva, absorbed in her new marriage and her growing involvement in the women's suffrage movement, wrote mostly about her own activities and political interests. She mentioned Consuelo's situation only to express satisfaction that her daughter had maintained her position despite what Alva called adjustments to English life. When Consuelo wrote back describing her health problems, Alva responded with advice about maintaining proper attitude and reminded her that all marriages required sacrifice and compromise. The letters from her father were shorter and less frequent. Brief notes about business matters, occasional mentions of his own activities, nothing that acknowledged the reality of Consuelo's existence. She began spending more time in the long library. the only space in Blenheim where she could be alone without servants constantly attending to her. She read indiscriminately, novels, histories, philosophy, poetry, finding temporary escape in other people's words. Sometimes she sat for hours without reading anything, simply existing in the silence of a room that demanded nothing from her. The head librarian, an elderly man who had served the family for decades, noticed her increasing presence but asked no questions. He began leaving books he thought she might find interesting on the table where she usually sat. They never spoke about it. The isolation from her sons deepened. John was now 5, Ivor 4. They had been shaped by their training into miniature aristocrats who displayed perfect manners and almost no spontaneous emotion. During Consuelo's scheduled visits to the nursery, they greeted her formally, answered her questions with rehearsed politeness, and returned to their activities when she left. The governess explained that the boys were progressing excellently in their education and that maternal involvement beyond the scheduled visits might confuse them about proper hierarchies. Consuelo stopped arguing. She understood that her children belonged to the institution of Blenheim more than they belonged to her. In 1903, the Duke's financial situation deteriorated again despite the Vanderbilt money. The annual income from Consuelo's trust could not cover both the palace's operating expenses and Marlborough's personal spending in London. He had accumulated debts through gambling and through maintaining his relationship with the woman Consuelo was not supposed to know about. He began pressuring Consuelo to request additional funds from her American trustees, explaining that the amounts originally agreed upon were insufficient given inflation and unexpected repairs. Consuelo contacted her trustees and discovered that Marlborough had already made multiple requests for increased payments without her knowledge. The trustees, acting on instructions from her father, had denied these requests. When she informed the Duke of this, he responded with rare directness. He said that she owed him more than had been provided. He had married her when other more suitable options were available. He had given her a title and position that American money alone could never purchase. The least she could do was ensure adequate financial support for maintaining that position. The conversation occurred in his study, one of the few times he had summoned her there for private discussion. He did not raise his voice. He stated his expectations as facts, waited for her acknowledgement, then dismissed her. Walking back to her apartments, Consuelo understood with new clarity that she would never be anything other than a purchased commodity whose value was measured by the money she could provide. Her health continued declining throughout 1903 and into 1904. The unexplained pains increased. She developed what the physician called nervous tremors, involuntary shaking in her hands that made writing difficult, and that became worse during social events. She lost weight until her clothes hung loose and had to be altered repeatedly. Her face in the mirror looked gaunt, older than her 27 years, marked by an exhaustion that sleep did nothing to relieve. In November 1904, she experienced what the physician described as a complete nervous collapse. She had been dressing for a dinner party when the room began spinning. She fell, lost consciousness, and did not wake for several hours. When she finally regained awareness, she could not remember where she was or why she was dressed in evening clothes. The physician ordered complete bed rest for 2 weeks and increased her medication again. Albertha expressed frustration that the collapse had forced cancellation of an important social gathering. Marlborough did not visit her during the recovery period. Lying in bed during those weeks, unable to do anything but exist, Consuelo began to understand that her body was trying to escape a situation her mind could not admit was intolerable. The illnesses were not failures of constitution or character. They were the only form of refusal available to someone who had been trained from childhood never to refuse anything. She was disappearing, and no one around her noticed or cared because the performance continued. The Duchess still appeared when required, still hosted when necessary, still fulfilled the functions she had been purchased to perform. What was happening to the woman inside that role was irrelevant to everyone, including increasingly to herself. In the spring of 1905, during one of Marlborough's extended absences in London, Consuelo received an unexpected visitor. Lady Alice Montague, a distant cousin of the Duke whom Consuelo had met only a few times at formal gatherings, arrived at Blenheim requesting a private conversation. Alice was 40, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and lived independently in London on money inherited from her father. The household staff showed her to the morning room where Consuelo sat attempting to answer correspondence she had been avoiding for weeks. Alice spoke directly. She said she had heard about Consuelo's health problems through family connections and had recognized symptoms she herself had experienced years earlier. During a brief disastrous engagement, she described waking up unable to breathe, experiencing pains that doctors could not explain, feeling as though her body was trying to kill her to escape a future she could not otherwise avoid. The engagement had ended when she finally admitted to herself that marriage to the man her family had selected would be a form of death. The physical symptoms had disappeared within weeks of that decision. Consuelo listened without responding. Alice's frankness violated every rule of polite conversation among their class. One did not discuss unhappiness in marriage, question the permanence of marital arrangements, or suggest that women had options beyond endurance. But the recognition of her own experience in Alice's words made denial impossible. Alice asked a simple question. Had Consuelo considered leaving? The question hung in the air between them. Consuelo found she could not answer immediately because she had not permitted herself to consider it seriously. Leaving would mean scandal, social death, permanent separation from her sons, and the loss of everything her life had been built around. It would mean admitting that the marriage her mother had arranged and that 1,200 guests had witnessed was a failure. It would mean acknowledging that she had endured 9 years of suffering for nothing. But Alice's question, once asked, could not be unheard. After she left, Consuelo sat alone in the morning room for hours, thinking about things she had taught herself not to think about. What if she simply left? Returned to America, used her own money, the trust her father had established remained under her control, to establish a life separate from Marlborough and Blenheim. The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine an alternative to the life she was living. Over the following weeks, she began making quiet inquiries. She wrote to her father's lawyers in New York, asking theoretical questions about trust arrangements and financial independence. She contacted her father directly, mentioning casually that she sometimes found English life isolating and wondered about maintaining a residence in America. The responses were cautious but not dismissive. Her money was indeed under her own control. Establishing a separate household was legally possible if she chose to pursue it. In June, she raised the possibility of separation with Marlborough during one of his brief returns to Blenheim. She did not frame it as a decision, only as something she was considering given their obvious incompatibility. He listened without interruption, his expression unchanging, until she finished speaking. Then he explained, with the patience of someone addressing a child, why separation was impossible. First, the scandal would be enormous. Divorce among the aristocracy did occur, but rarely, and always with devastating social consequences. Consuelo would be ostracized from English society completely. Her sons, as members of the Marlborough family, would remain at Blenheim. She would have no legal right to them beyond whatever limited visitation he chose to permit. English law gave fathers absolute custody of children in cases of marital dissolution. Second, the financial arrangements that had made their marriage possible would become complicated in ways that benefited no one. The trust payments to Marlborough would likely continue regardless of their living arrangements, but legal battles over the terms would be expensive and protracted. Her father, who controlled the trust's administration, would not appreciate having family finances exposed in court proceedings. Third, and most important, what exactly did she imagine she would do? Return to New York as a failed duchess, a woman who could not manage the position she had been given? Alva would be humiliated. The Vanderbilt family reputation would be damaged. Consuelo herself would become a cautionary tale, pitied by some and condemned by others as an example of American inability to maintain aristocratic standards. He delivered this analysis calmly, without anger or emotion. When he finished, he added that if she was unhappy, that was unfortunate but not unusual. Many marriages were matters of duty rather than affection. She had been raised with every advantage, given a title women would sacrifice anything to obtain, and provided with resources that made most forms of suffering impossible. If she could not find satisfaction in these circumstances, the failure was hers, not the marriage's. Consuelo did not argue. Marlborough had articulated realities she had already understood, but had hoped might be less absolute than they were. The conversation ended with his departure for London the following morning and her return to the routine that had defined the past 9 years. But something had shifted. The possibility of escape, even if blocked by obstacles too large to overcome, had been acknowledged. She could not unsee the cage she lived in, could not return to the passive acceptance that had sustained her through the worst years. She began paying more attention to details she had previously ignored: the specific terms of her trust arrangements, the legal precedents for aristocratic separations, the examples of other women who had left marriages and survived the consequences. In August, she discovered that Marlborough's London woman had given birth to a child. The news reached her through household staff who had heard it from servants traveling between London and Blenheim. The Duke had been supporting this woman for years in a house he maintained in Chelsea. Their relationship was an open secret among people who paid attention to such things. The child's existence made no difference legally. Illegitimate children had no claim on titles or inheritance, but it clarified the nature of Consuelo's position. She was the official wife, the mother of legitimate heirs, the keeper of appearances. The actual elements of life that might involve affection or intimacy occurred elsewhere, with someone else. She wrote to Alice Montague that autumn, thanking her for the visit and mentioning that she had been thinking about their conversation. Alice responded immediately, inviting Consuelo to stay with her in London whenever she needed refuge. The invitation was not immediately actionable. Leaving Blenheim even for a visit required negotiation with staff and coordination with schedules. But knowing it existed provided something Consuelo had not possessed before: evidence that alternatives, however difficult, were not entirely impossible. The years between 1905 and 1907 passed in a state of suspended decision. Consuelo remained at Blenheim, fulfilling her obligations, appearing at required events, maintaining the performance that had become indistinguishable from her existence. But the possibility of leaving, once acknowledged, created a constant tension beneath the surface of daily life. She was waiting, though for what? Exactly she could not articulate even to herself. Marlborough's absences grew longer and less explained. He spent most of 1906 in London, returning to Blenheim only when estate business or social obligations required his presence. The fiction that they maintained a functional marriage became increasingly difficult to sustain. At dinner parties, guests noticed the coldness between them. In correspondence, family members began asking carefully worded questions about whether everything was satisfactory. Albertha, whose authority depended on maintaining Marlborough family reputation, started expressing concern that rumors were circulating about the Duke's London arrangements. In January 1907, Consuelo fell ill again, the same unexplained symptoms that had plagued her for years, but more severe. The chest pains became constant. She could not sleep more than a few hours each night. Her weight dropped to a level the physician finally acknowledged as dangerous. He recommended that she travel to the continent for rest and warmer climate, suggesting that English winters were contributing to her decline. The recommendation provided an excuse to leave Blenheim that even Albertha could not oppose. Consuelo traveled to the south of France in February, accompanied only by a lady's maid. She stayed at a hotel in Nice, spending her days walking along the Mediterranean coast, eating small meals at restaurants where no one knew who she was, existing for the first time in years without a schedule of obligations. The distance from Blenheim allowed her to see her life with new clarity. She was 30 years old. She had been married 12 years. Her sons were 9 and 8, strangers being raised to perpetuate the same system that had trapped her. If she continued as she was, she would spend the next 40 years performing the same functions, watching her health deteriorate, existing as an expensive piece of furniture in a palace that felt like a prison. She wrote to her father from Nice, explaining more directly than she ever had before that her marriage was intolerable and that she was considering permanent separation. William Kissam's response took 3 weeks to arrive. He acknowledged her unhappiness but counseled patience and discretion. Separation would create complications: financial, social, familial. He suggested that she and Marlborough could reach an arrangement that allowed them to live separate lives while maintaining public appearances. Many aristocratic couples maintained such arrangements without formal separation. His letter also mentioned that Alva was firmly opposed to any action that might damage the family's reputation. Alva had worked too hard to secure Consuelo's position to watch it dismantled through scandal. She believed, William wrote, that Consuelo was being selfish and short-sighted, unable to see past temporary difficulties to the long-term advantages of her situation. Consuelo stayed in France through the spring, extending her absence with claims of continuing health problems. Marlborough did not object. The separation benefited him as much as it did her. Without his wife's presence at Blenheim, he could conduct his London life more freely. He wrote occasionally. Brief letters about estate business and the children's education. Nothing personal. The correspondence confirmed what Consuelo had suspected. He would prefer the marriage to continue without her actual presence becoming inconvenient. In May, she received an unexpected visitor at her Nice hotel. Winthrop Rutherford had learned of her location through mutual connections and had traveled to France specifically to see her. They met in the hotel's garden, surrounded by flowering plants, speaking for the first time in 12 years. He was 41 now, unmarried, still maintaining the same easy manner she remembered. He said he had followed her situation from a distance, heard rumors about her unhappiness, wanted to see for himself if she was well. The conversation lasted 2 hours. They spoke carefully, both aware that even meeting was improper and that any suggestion of impropriety could be used against her in custody proceedings. Rutherford asked directly, what did she want? Not what others expected or what circumstances allowed, but what she actually wanted for her own life. Consuelo found she could not answer immediately. She had spent so many years not asking herself that question that accessing her own desires felt like reaching for something in a dark room, uncertain if anything was there to grasp. Finally, she said she wanted freedom from the performance, from the constant surveillance, from the obligation to maintain appearances in a marriage that had never contained anything genuine. She wanted to see her sons grow up without having those interactions mediated by governesses and schedules. She wanted to live in a place where her existence mattered as something other than a social function. Rutherford listened without offering solutions. Before leaving, he told her that whatever she decided, she should not remain in circumstances that were destroying her. He had watched her at social events over the years, seen the way she disappeared inside herself, and it had troubled him more than he could say. If she needed help, financial, legal, simply someone to talk to honestly, she should contact him. Then he left, and she did not see him again for years. The meeting forced a decision Consuelo had been avoiding. She returned to England in June, but did not go directly to Blenheim. Instead, she stayed with Alice Montague in London and arranged a meeting with solicitors. The legal situation was exactly as Marlborough had described. Separation was possible, but she would lose custody of her sons. English law presumed that children belonged with their father, especially sons who would inherit titles and estates. She could petition for visitation rights, but Marlborough would control when and how often she saw them. The solicitors also explained that while she could not be forced to live with her husband, leaving the marriage would result in permanent social consequences. She would not be received at court. Aristocratic families would close their doors to her. Her sons, when old enough to understand, would be told that their mother had abandoned her duties and brought scandal on the family name. She spent 2 weeks in London weighing these consequences against the cost of continuing as she had been. Neither option was tolerable. Both involved losses she was not certain she could survive. In the end, the decision came down to a simple calculation. Which form of suffering would destroy her more slowly? In August 1907, Consuelo informed Marlborough by letter that she would not be returning to Blenheim as his wife. She proposed an arrangement. They would separate without formal divorce proceedings, maintain separate residences, and present a united front publicly when absolutely necessary. She would retain access to her sons during school holidays and at other agreed-upon times. Her trust income would continue to provide the annual payments he required, but she would establish her own household away from his control. Marlborough's response arrived within a week. He found the arrangement acceptable with modifications. She could not establish a residence in London. That would make the separation too visible and invite constant speculation. Her access to the children would be limited to prevent confusion about their primary household and loyalties. She was not to discuss the separation with anyone outside immediate family. Any public acknowledgement of marital difficulties would be considered a violation of the agreement and grounds for cutting off all contact with their sons. The terms were harsh, but not surprising. Consuelo accepted them because negotiating for better would have required leverage she did not possess. In September, she sailed for New York, telling the few people who asked that she was visiting her family for an extended period. The newspapers reported her departure as a temporary return to America for health reasons. No one publicly acknowledged that she had left her marriage. New York had changed in the 12 years since her wedding. The city was larger, louder, more aggressively modern. The Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue felt smaller than she remembered, cluttered with furniture and objects that demonstrated wealth without taste. Her father still lived there, now with his second wife, a woman 30 years younger than him who treated Consuelo with polite indifference. William Kassam had aged considerably, his face showing the effects of years spent pursuing pleasures that no longer seemed to provide satisfaction. He welcomed Consuelo's return, but made clear that her presence created complications he had not anticipated. Questions would be asked about why the Duchess of Marlborough was residing in New York without her husband. Stories would circulate. The family's carefully maintained reputation would be examined and possibly damaged. He suggested that she might be more comfortable establishing a residence outside the city, somewhere she could live quietly without attracting constant attention. Alva, now Mrs. Oliver Belmont, responded to news of the separation with barely concealed fury. She arrived at the Fifth Avenue mansion 3 days after Consuelo's return and demanded a private conversation. What followed was a confrontation that lasted 2 hours, during which Alva expressed her opinion that Consuelo had thrown away the greatest achievement of her life out of childish inability to accept adult responsibilities. Alva said she had sacrificed everything to secure Consuelo's position, her own reputation, her marriage to William Kassam, years of planning and negotiation. She had given Consuelo opportunities that no amount of money could usually purchase: a title, entrance to the highest levels of European society, children who would be among England's aristocracy. And Consuelo had responded by running away like a girl, afraid of her own good fortune. The conversation revealed what Consuelo had long suspected. Alva's investment in the marriage was about her own vindication, not her daughter's happiness. Consuelo's success as a duchess proved that Alva had been right about everything, about the value of European aristocracy, about the insufficiency of American society, about the possibility of transcending the limitations of being new money. Consuelo's failure undid that proof and suggested that Alva's vision had been flawed from the beginning. Consuelo attempted to explain that she had not failed through lack of effort. She had performed every required duty for 12 years. She had produced heirs, hosted social events, maintained appearances despite illness and isolation. The marriage had failed not because she was inadequate, but because it had never been a marriage, only a financial arrangement that required her to disappear inside a role until nothing else remained. Alva did not accept this interpretation. She said that all marriages required sacrifice and that aristocratic marriages required more than most. Consuelo's suffering was ordinary, her response to it was weak, and her decision to leave would be regretted once she understood what she had lost. The conversation ended with Alva's declaration that she would not support this separation financially or socially. If Consuelo insisted on this course, she would do it without her mother's approval. The rejection was absolute but not unexpected. Consuelo had understood for years that her mother's love was conditional on her daughter's success at fulfilling the role she had been assigned. Without that success, the relationship had no foundation. She found a house to rent in Oyster Bay, far enough from Manhattan to avoid constant surveillance, but close enough to maintain minimal connection to her family. The house was modest by Vanderbilt standards: 15 rooms, small grounds, staff of only 6. She furnished it simply, choosing comfort over display, creating spaces that felt like they belonged to a person rather than a museum. For the first time since childhood, she lived in rooms where she could arrange objects according to her own preferences, sit without worrying about posture, exist without constant observation. But the freedom was incomplete and unsatisfying. Her sons remained in England under Marlborough's control. Letters from them arrived monthly, written with careful formality that suggested supervision. John, now 10, wrote about his studies and sporting activities in language that sounded like it had been drafted by a tutor. Ivor, 9, was less guarded but still distant, describing a life at Blenheim that continued unchanged by his mother's absence. Neither boy mentioned missing her. Neither asked when she would return. She attempted to build a life in New York that resembled normalcy. She attended concerts and lectures, took French lessons, volunteered with charitable organizations focused on improving conditions for working women. But she was marked by her history in ways that prevented real integration into any community. To Americans, she was the Duchess who had abandoned her title. To her own class, she was an embarrassment who had violated the unstated rule that unhappy marriages were to be endured privately. Invitations came rarely and from people whose interest in her situation felt more like curiosity than friendship. In 1908, she returned to England for a month-long visit with her sons at Blenheim. Marlborough permitted the visit but established strict parameters. She would stay in guest quarters, not in the Duchess's apartments. Her interactions with the children would occur at scheduled times. She would not discuss the separation with them or suggest that their current arrangements were anything other than permanent. The visit was worse than the separation had been. John and Ivor had adapted to her absence by creating distance that protected them from confusion about where their loyalties belonged. They were polite during her visits, answered her questions, tolerated her attempts at affection, but they had become Marlborough's sons completely, shaped by an institution that required them to value duty over feeling, position over personal connection. She recognized in them the same training she had endured, the same disappearance of self that had nearly destroyed her. She could do nothing to prevent it. Consuelo spent 3 years suspended between separation and resolution. She could not divorce Marlborough without sacrificing what little access she retained to her sons. She could not return to Blenheim without accepting conditions that would destroy whatever remained of herself. She existed in a state of legal attachment to a man she had not lived with since 1907 and would not live with again. During this period, she traveled frequently between America and Europe, staying with the few friends who maintained contact despite the irregularity of her situation. In Paris, during the winter of 1910, she met Jacques Balsan at a dinner party hosted by mutual acquaintances. He was 43, a French aviator and businessman from an old family whose textile fortune predated the Revolution. He had fought in the Franco-Prussian War as a young man, developed interest in early aviation, and lived independently on inherited wealth that required no particular effort to maintain. Balsan was direct in ways that European aristocrats rarely were. He asked about her situation without pretending not to know the details. He expressed surprise that she remained married to someone she clearly despised, and wondered aloud why she did not simply formalize the separation and move on with her life. When she explained the complications, the children, the social consequences, the legal obstacles, he listened but did not pretend to find them insurmountable. People, he suggested, made choices every day that violated social expectations and survived the consequences. They began seeing each other regularly during her stays in Paris. Balsan made no demands and offered no promises. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on subjects beyond social obligation, politics, literature, the changing world they were living through. He spoke about his experiences in early aviation, describing the sensation of flight in ways that made it sound like freedom made tangible. He was not impressed by titles or lineage. His family's money was old enough that he felt no need to demonstrate its existence through visible expenditure. In 1911, Marlborough made clear that he intended to seek an annulment of their marriage through the Catholic Church. He had been received into the Catholic faith the previous year, a decision motivated partly by genuine religious conviction and partly by desire to access annulment procedures not available through the Church of England. An annulment would allow him to remarry within the Church and produce additional heirs with a woman of his choosing, someone he had been involved with for several years and wished to make his legitimate wife. The grounds for annulment were technical. Consuelo had been coerced into the marriage, and coercion invalidated consent. This was factually accurate but legally complicated. Proving coercion required testimony about Alva's threats and Consuelo's state of mind in 1895. The Catholic tribunal would need evidence that she had married under duress rather than free will. Marlborough needed Consuelo's cooperation to make the case convincing. He proposed a bargain. She would provide testimony supporting the annulment, and in exchange, he would grant her a civil divorce that would allow her to remarry. The terms included formal acknowledgement that their sons were legitimate despite the marriage being declared invalid, a point of canon law that required papal approval, but that Marlborough's lawyers assured her could be secured. The offer presented a solution to the suspended state she had occupied for years. Civil divorce would free her legally. The annulment, while offensive in its requirement that she declare publicly what her mother had done to her, would be a statement of truth about the marriage's origins. After 16 years of maintaining fictions, the opportunity to speak honestly about what had occurred in 1895 had unexpected appeal. She agreed to cooperate. The proceedings began in 1913 and continued through the beginning of the war. Consuelo provided testimony to the Catholic tribunal describing her mother's threats, her own resistance to the marriage, and the coercive circumstances that had made refusal impossible. She detailed conversations, letters, the specific ways Alva had engineered her consent through combinations of manipulation and explicit threat. The testimony was intimate and humiliating, requiring her to expose private family dynamics to church officials who questioned her extensively about her motives and truthfulness. Alva was furious when she learned about the testimony. She wrote to Consuelo accusing her of betrayal and dishonesty. Alva claimed that she had never threatened her daughter, only guided her toward appropriate choices. Any pressure Consuelo felt had been imagined or exaggerated in retrospect to justify her failure to maintain her marriage. The letter ended with Alva's declaration that she considered their relationship severed permanently. The rupture with her mother felt like relief rather than loss. Consuelo had been seeking Alva's approval for 36 years and receiving it only when she performed exactly as instructed. The withdrawal of that conditional acceptance freed her from obligations that had shaped her life since childhood. The Catholic annulment was granted in 1926, with the civil divorce finalized shortly after. The legal maneuvering took 13 years from start to finish, delayed by the war and by the tribunal's slow processing of the case. Consuelo was 49 years old when the marriage was finally officially dissolved. Her sons were adults, John 29, Ivor 28. Both had served in the war. Both had established their own lives within the aristocratic system that had produced them. Their relationships with their mother remained cordial but distant, shaped permanently by the years of separation during their childhood. Balsan had waited. He had been present throughout the annulment proceedings, offering support without pressure. He had made clear years earlier that he wished to marry her, but would not push her toward decisions she was not ready to make. When the divorce was finalized, he asked again. This time, she said yes. They married in Paris in 1921, a small ceremony with few guests. Consuelo was 44, Balsan 54. The marriage was nothing like her first. Balsan treated her as an equal whose opinions mattered, whose presence he actively enjoyed, whose happiness he considered worth pursuing. They divided time between his estate in France and travel throughout Europe. She learned to fly in a plane he piloted, experiencing the sensation of rising above landscapes that had constrained her entire life. But the years lost could not be recovered. She had spent her youth fulfilling obligations to a system that had given her nothing. Her children barely knew her. Her relationship with her mother was permanently destroyed. The freedom she finally achieved came decades after the age when freedom might have allowed her to build something new. She was learning to exist as herself at an age when most people had long since settled into whoever they were going to become. The annulment, when it was finally granted in 1926, arrived with public attention Consuelo had not anticipated. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reported the story with enthusiasm, focusing on the sensational elements. An American heiress coerced into marriage, millions paid for a title, years of suffering in an English palace. The coverage treated her story as vindication, proof that wealth and position could not compensate for marriage without consent. Editorial writers used her case to argue various points about women's autonomy, aristocratic corruption, and the failures of arranged marriages. Consuelo read these accounts with complicated feelings. The facts they reported were accurate. She had been coerced. The marriage had been a transaction. She had suffered in ways the public could not fully understand. But the coverage transformed her life into a parable with lessons that felt imposed rather than earned. She had not endured 31 years of marriage and separation to provide material for morality tales. The vindication others saw in the annulment felt hollow, because it came too late to change anything that mattered. Alva read the coverage as personal attack. She responded with a public statement declaring that Consuelo had misrepresented their family dynamics. and that any pressure she had exerted was normal maternal guidance appropriate to their circumstances. Alva insisted she had acted in her daughter's best interests, providing opportunities most women could only dream of attaining. If Consuelo chose to reinterpret loving guidance as coercion, that reflected poorly on her character rather than on Alva's motherhood. The statement revealed what Consuelo had long understood. Alva was incapable of acknowledging error. To admit she had forced her daughter into an intolerable marriage would require admitting that her life's central project had been built on her daughter's suffering. Alva could not accept that revision of her own narrative. She died in 1933 without reconciling with Consuelo, insisting until the end that she had acted correctly and that her daughter's unhappiness was evidence of weakness rather than consequence of cruelty. In 1934, Consuelo published her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold. She wrote it partly for income. Balsan's fortune was substantial, but the Depression had reduced everyone's resources, and partly to control the narrative of her own life. The book was carefully written, revealing enough to be honest, but restrained enough to avoid complete scandal. She described her childhood under Alva's control, the forced marriage to Marlborough, the loneliness and isolation of her years at Blenheim. She wrote about the annulment and her eventual marriage to Balsan with discretion that protected both her sons and her second husband from embarrassment. The book sold well and received sympathetic reviews. Readers responded to the story of a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control who eventually found freedom. Critics praised her restraint and honesty, but the publication created new complications in her already strained relationship with her sons. John, now the Duke of Marlborough, following his father's death in 1934, felt the book portrayed Blenheim and the Marlborough family unfairly. He believed his mother had exaggerated her suffering and minimized the advantages the marriage had provided her. Their correspondence became cooler after the book's publication, eventually diminishing to brief exchanges on birthdays and holidays. Ivor maintained slightly warmer relations, but made clear that he found the public discussion of family matters distasteful. He had lived with the consequences of his parents' separation throughout his youth, and did not appreciate having those circumstances examined again for public consumption. Both sons had built lives within the aristocratic system that had shaped them. Their mother's critique of that system, however valid from her perspective, felt like criticism of their choices and values. The vindication the book supposedly offered felt incomplete. Consuelo had told her story, established the facts of her coerced marriage, provided evidence that her suffering had been real. But the telling changed nothing for her sons, improved nothing in those relationships, and arrived too late to matter to the person whose approval she had once desperately sought. Alva was dead. Marlborough was dead. The world that had enabled their transaction was already disappearing, made obsolete by wars and social changes that rendered aristocratic marriages less economically necessary. By the late 1930s, Consuelo was living a comfortable life with Balsan between Paris and his country estate. They entertained friends, traveled when they wished, maintained connection to both American and European social circles. She involved herself in charitable work, particularly organizations supporting women's education and independence. The work felt meaningful in ways her Blenheim obligations never had, because it was chosen rather than assigned. But she could not escape awareness that the life she was finally living was a compromise with time. She was 60 years old when her autobiography was published. The years when freedom might have allowed her to build something entirely new were decades past. She had married Balsan at 44, already shaped by experiences that could not be undone. The kindness he showed her, the respect their relationship contained, was genuine and valuable. It was also a late consolation for losses that remained permanent. Her health, damaged by the years of stress at Blenheim, never fully recovered. The unexplained pains and illnesses that had plagued her in her 20s and 30s returned periodically, less severe but persistent. Doctors continued to find nothing medically wrong, as though her body had learned to express suffering as its default state and could not forget the pattern even when circumstances improved. She managed the symptoms with the same composure she had learned as a child, treating physical discomfort as another obligation to be endured without complaint. The outbreak of war in 1939 disrupted the life she and Balsan had constructed. They left France ahead of the German occupation, eventually settling in New York for the duration. The displacement brought her back to a city that felt even more foreign than it had when she returned in 1907. Her father was dead. The Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue had been demolished. The world of her childhood had been replaced by something faster, less interested in the social hierarchies that had once seemed permanent. She spent the war years in New York engaging in relief work, using her connections to raise money for refugees and displaced persons. The work was concrete and useful, requiring organizational skills rather than social performance. She was good at it in ways she had never been good at being a duchess. But it also felt like penance for years spent in excessive comfort while others suffered, an attempt to balance accounts that could never actually be balanced. When the war ended, she and Balsan returned to France to find his estate had survived relatively intact. They resumed the life they had built before the war, older now and more aware of how little time remained. Consuelo was 68. The vindication she had supposedly achieved through annulment and autobiography had provided clarity about the past but changed nothing about the present except to confirm what she already knew. Some losses cannot be recovered. Some years cannot be relived. Some choices cannot be unmade regardless of how publicly their consequences are acknowledged. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died in January 1933 at her Paris residence. She was 80 years old and had remained active in the women's suffrage movement until the final months of her life. The newspapers reported her death as the passing of a pioneering feminist and social reformer who had used her wealth to advance women's political rights. They mentioned her role in the women's suffrage movement, her fundraising for political causes, her strategic use of social position to force changes in law and custom. The obituaries described her as a woman ahead of her time, someone who had understood that power could be redirected toward progressive ends. Consuelo read these accounts from her apartment in Paris and recognized almost nothing of the woman who had raised her. The public Alva, the suffragist, the reformer, the advocate for women's autonomy, existed alongside the private Alva who had eliminated her daughter's autonomy entirely, who had forced marriage through explicit threat, who had valued social position above her child's well-being. The contradiction was never acknowledged in the obituaries. Both versions were true. Neither canceled the other. The will revealed the extent of Alva's wealth and the complications of her estate. She owned multiple properties: Marble House in Newport, a townhouse in New York, the Paris residence where she had died. She had accumulated art, jewelry, furniture, and various objects whose combined value exceeded several $1,000,000. The will distributed these assets among various beneficiaries, including substantial donations to women's suffrage organizations and universities. Consuelo received a modest bequest, considerably less than what Alva left to political causes she supported. The unequal distribution was intentional and clear. Alva had never forgiven the annulment testimony, never accepted Consuelo's characterization of the 1895 marriage as coerced. The will represented a final judgment on their relationship. Consuelo had failed to be the daughter Alva needed, and the limited inheritance reflected that failure. Consuelo signed the necessary papers and did not contest the distribution. Fighting over her mother's money would have required engaging with her mother's judgment, and she was exhausted by the effort of caring what Alva thought. But the properties themselves presented problems that money could not solve. Marble House, the $11 million palace Alva had built in Newport, required enormous resources to maintain. The annual operating costs exceeded what any individual could reasonably spend on a summer residence. Alva had used it as a venue for political gatherings and suffrage events in her later years, but without her presence to give it purpose, the building was simply an enormous empty monument to wealth that no longer meant what it had in 1892. Consuelo inherited partial interest in Marble House, along with other family members. None of them wanted to live there. The building was too large, too expensive, too much a reminder of an era whose values they no longer shared. Attempts to sell it failed. No buyer existed for a palace that required a staff of dozens and maintenance costs that exceeded most people's annual income. The property sat empty through the 1930s, deteriorating slowly, becoming a problem no one in the family knew how to solve. The fate of Marble House felt fitting to Consuelo in ways she did not try to articulate to others. The building had been constructed to demonstrate Alva's triumph over social forces that had tried to exclude her. It had served as the setting for elaborate parties designed to force acceptance from people who considered the Vanderbilts beneath them. It had been the stage where Consuelo's own future was decided, where negotiations occurred that led to her marriage to Marlborough. Now it stood empty, wanted by no one, too expensive to maintain and too large to adapt to changing circumstances. Other Vanderbilt properties faced similar fates. The Fifth Avenue Chateau, where Consuelo had grown up, was demolished in 1927 to make room for commercial development. The mansion her grandfather Cornelius had built was torn down to accommodate a department store. Biltmore, the enormous North Carolina estate built by her Uncle George, was converted into a tourist attraction after his death because no private individual could afford to maintain it. The physical structures that had demonstrated Vanderbilt power were disappearing or being transformed into public curiosities, monuments to wealth that had stopped making sense even to wealthy people. Blenheim Palace faced different problems but similar underlying realities. The palace remained in the Marlborough family, now controlled by Consuelo's son John, but the costs of maintenance continued to exceed available resources, despite Vanderbilt money. John had opened portions of the palace to tourists to generate income. Paying visitors walked through staterooms that had once been private, examining furniture and paintings, while guides narrated the building's history. The palace had become a museum that a duke happened to live in, its primary function now to attract enough visitors to fund its own continued existence. Consuelo visited Blenheim once in the years after Alva's death, staying as a guest in her son's house. The visit felt strange and disorienting. She walked through rooms where she had spent years suffocating, seeing them now as tourists saw them, impressive, historic, beautiful in their way, but empty of the human suffering they had contained. The long library where she had hidden during the worst years looked smaller than she remembered. The bedroom where Marlborough had visited her to produce heirs was now shown to visitors as an example of 18th-century aristocratic life. Nothing about the palace acknowledged what it had actually been to the people who had lived there. John treated her with polite formality during the visit. He showed her the improvements he had made to the estate, the systems he had implemented to manage tourist access, the financial strategies that allowed him to maintain the property. He was proud of his stewardship of Blenheim and seemed to expect her to share that pride. She tried to express appropriate appreciation while privately thinking that he was dedicating his life to preserving a structure that represented everything that had nearly destroyed her. The conversation never touched on her years as Duchess or the circumstances that had ended the marriage. John had constructed a narrative about his parents' relationship that positioned the separation as unfortunate but inevitable given their incompatibility. He did not acknowledge coercion or suffering. To acknowledge those elements would require confronting the system that had produced him and that he now worked to maintain. It was easier to treat the past as closed rather than examine what it meant. Consuelo left Blenheim after 3 days, knowing she would not return. The palace no longer held power over her, but it also offered nothing she needed. It was a building being preserved at enormous cost because people believed historic structures deserved preservation, regardless of what they represented or what they required. She understood that her sons would probably continue this preservation work until they died, then pass the obligation to their own children, perpetuating a cycle that served the building rather than the people attached to it. Jacques Balsan died in 1956 at the age of 89. He had been ill for several months, his body finally surrendering to age after a life that had included wars, aviation accidents, and decades of active engagement with the world. Consuelo was 79, and the loss left her alone in a way she had not been since she married him 35 years earlier. The marriage had given her something the first had not: companionship, respect, the daily experience of being treated as though her presence mattered for reasons beyond social obligation or financial necessity. His absence created a void that could not be filled. She remained in France after his death, living quietly at the estate they had shared. Her health continued its slow decline. The same mysterious ailments that had plagued her at Blenheim returned with increasing frequency. Doctors still found nothing conclusively wrong, though at her age they attributed the symptoms to general physical deterioration rather than nervous disorders. She accepted the pain as a permanent condition, managing it with medication and by limiting her activities to what her body would tolerate. Her sons visited occasionally, usually during holidays or when business brought them to France. John, now in his late 50s, had been Duke of Marlborough for over 20 years, and had settled into the role with the resigned dedication of someone managing an obligation too expensive to abandon. He spoke about Blenheim's financial problems, the ongoing struggle to maintain the palace while paying taxes that treated historic properties as luxury rather than burden. He had married and divorced, producing an heir who would eventually inherit the same problems. The cycle continued. Ivor had lived a quieter life, serving in various military and diplomatic positions that kept him traveling. He had never married, maintaining instead a series of relationships that avoided the permanent commitments his parents' marriage had taught him to distrust. He was warmer with Consuelo than John was, willing to reminisce about childhood in ways his brother considered inappropriate, but the warmth was limited by decades of distance that had never been adequately bridged. They were cordial strangers who shared genetics and history, but little actual understanding of each other's lives. Consuelo's relationship with her grandchildren was even more attenuated. They were English aristocrats raised in the same system that had shaped their fathers, taught the same values, trained in the same performance of duty over feeling. When they visited her in France, they were polite and correct, addressing her with formal respect that maintained appropriate distance. She was their American grandmother who had caused some scandal in the past, a figure more historical than personal. They knew the outlines of her story but seemed uninterested in its details, as though the specifics were less important than the fact that everything had eventually been resolved appropriately. She wrote occasionally to old friends, the few who remained alive. Most of her generation had died, people she had known in Newport during her youth, companions from her years in England, American acquaintances who had followed her career from a distance. The letters she exchanged with survivors focused on health complaints, memories of people no longer living, and observations about a world that had changed beyond recognition. No one discussed the future because the future for all of them was short and obvious. In 1960, Consuelo made her last trip to America. She was 83 and traveled primarily to settle remaining financial matters and to see what remained of her family's American presence. The Vanderbilt mansion was gone. Marble House had been donated to a preservation society, converted into a museum where tourists paid admission to walk through rooms where she had been a child. She visited once, moving through the spaces as an anonymous elderly woman among crowds who did not recognize her. A guide narrated the history of the house, mentioning her name in passing as one of Alva Vanderbilt's children, noting that she had married a duke. The guide said nothing about coercion or suffering. The official history was about architecture and social ambition, not about the cost those things had exacted from actual people. She stood in her old bedroom, now preserved as an example of Gilded Age luxury, and felt nothing. The room was smaller than she remembered. The ocean view that had once represented everything beyond her reach was now something she could access anytime simply by choosing to look. The cage that had contained her was now a tourist attraction, its purpose transformed from confinement to education about how wealthy people had lived. Whether anyone learned anything useful from viewing it, she could not say. Her health deteriorated significantly after the American trip. The travel had exhausted reserves she no longer possessed. Back in France, she spent increasing amounts of time confined to bed, unable to manage the basic activities that constituted daily life. She hired nurses to assist with personal care, signing documents that gave others authority to manage her medical decisions when she could no longer make them herself. The preparations for death were handled with the same organizational efficiency she had learned as a young woman preparing for social obligations. John visited in the spring of 1964, staying 3 days at the estate. He was 66, his hair white, his face lined by decades of responsibility he had never asked for but had accepted as inheritance. They spoke little during his visit. There was not much left to say that had not been said or deliberately left unsaid over the years. On his final day, he thanked her for the Vanderbilt money that had saved Blenheim, acknowledging explicitly what had usually remained unspoken. She nodded, too tired to explain that she had never wanted her money to save Blenheim, that the palace's survival had cost her decades of her life, that she would have preferred to let it collapse under its own impossible weight rather than see it preserved through her suffering. He left without understanding this, and she made no effort to explain it. Some gaps could not be bridged through conversation, especially when both parties had spent their lives learning to communicate through polite deflection rather than honesty. Consuelo Vanderbilt died on December 6, 1964, at the age of 87. The newspapers reported her death with brief obituaries that noted her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, the annulment that had made headlines decades earlier, and her autobiography. The coverage was respectful but limited. She had outlived the era when her story mattered to readers who had not lived through it. She was a curiosity from a vanished world, a woman whose experiences reflected social systems that no longer operated with the same brutality, because they no longer operated at all in their original form. She was buried in France beside Jacques Balsan, her second husband. The funeral was small, attended by her sons, a few surviving friends, and household staff. No representatives from the Marlborough family came. The Duke, now her grandson, sent a formal message of condolence, but did not attend. Blenheim continued without acknowledging her passing. The estates remain. Blenheim still stands in Oxfordshire, open to tourists who pay to walk through rooms that once contained a marriage. The palace requires constant maintenance, constant infusions of money, constant justification for its continued existence. The current Duke manages it as his grandfather and great-grandfather did, preserving a structure too historically significant to abandon and too expensive to maintain without treating it as public spectacle. Marble House functions similarly in Newport. Visitors are told about Alva Vanderbilt's architectural vision, about the Gilded Age's excess, about a daughter who became a duchess. The narrative is carefully curated. What happened in those rooms? The daily inspections, the steel rod against a child's spine, the negotiations that turned a 17-year-old into a commodity, exists in historical records, but not in the tour guide scripts. The Vanderbilt fortune that made everything possible has been dispersed, subdivided, diminished through generations of inheritance taxes and poor investments and simple expenditure. The wealth that seemed infinite in 1895 proved finite after all. No current Vanderbilt descendant possesses resources comparable to what Consuelo's grandfather controlled. The empire built on railroads and shipping dissolved into trust funds and real estate holdings and objects in museums. Consuelo's sons lived into old age and died without resolving what their mother's life had meant or cost. They preserved Blenheim, fulfilled their duties, passed their obligations to the next generation. Whether they understood what had been sacrificed to maintain the system they served is unknowable. They left no records suggesting they asked the question. The annulment that declared the marriage invalid remains a canonical decision, cited occasionally in ecclesiastical legal discussions. The marriage that was ruled to have never validly existed produced 2 sons, multiple grandchildren, and decades of consequences that continued long after the Church determined those consequences stemmed from a union that lacked proper consent. What remains most clearly is the gap between what wealth promised and what it delivered, the distance between the life constructed through millions of dollars in careful planning and the life actually lived by the woman those millions purchased. That distance was never closed. The structures built to demonstrate power stand empty or converted to public use, monuments to ambitions that consumed the people they were meant to elevate. The question of whether any of it was worth what it cost was never answered, perhaps because no one with authority to answer it ever seriously asked.